Wells Fargo Bank, Michael Church, Addison Capital President, and Paul Schatz, Heritage Capital President. Paul, start with you. A booming manufacturing report from the ISMs that included a booming price component, aka inflation. How do you read the implications?
Good morning, Larry. Listen, I think the economy is going to surprise to the upside the first half of the year. I think for all the panning that Bernanke got for QE2, I think it's had unintended benefits. We're going to see a stronger economy. I haven't been worried about inflation for 3 years. I'm not worried about inflation now until we see wage growth, until we see capacity utilization spiking, until we see money velocity increasing, really. I'm not going to worry about inflation. I think it's a very secondary issue way down the road.
Michael, on one hand, stocks had their best January in 14 years. On the other hand, depending on what numbers you're looking at, it looks like the S&P is trading at something like 13 times 2011 earnings. Is the market cheap or expensive here? What do you think?
I think it's fairly valued, but I would take issue with what the previous guest just mentioned. I think inflation is going to be an issue, and I think it's here now, and you're seeing it. I think this issue in Egypt is, in fact, what we're seeing, inflation playing out. These emerging economies are seeing major inflation. Their food components of their consumer baskets are, in some cases, upwards of 80%. Food component of CPI in the U.S., 15%, no big deal for us. In an emerging market, you're seeing major inflation, and this is something that's going to continue to play out for the rest of the year.
Okay, so how does that play out? What does that make you want to do?
I think you look at the ag sector. I think you can continue to make nice money in the ag sector. A company like Monsanto, which had lagged a lot of the rest of its peers, which is still the technology leader, these are stocks that are going to do just fine in an environment like this.
I just got a note saying that Egypt's ETF has reopened, and it's actually up 5% after having dropped almost 14% last week. With that in mind, Eric, it sounds like some investors are basically coming to grips with all this, and they're dismissing Egypt as a concern, but you don't agree with that. You actually think that inflation, again, is a real systemic problem. Explain to us your thinking.
Sure, inflation is definitely a systemic problem globally. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but what we're seeing in Egypt is not just a political movement, it's also a consumer movement, and that's where investors need to be protecting on the potential downside, but also looking for opportunities with the emergence of a global consumer class.
So are you buying into commodities and some of the ag names that we just heard?
Absolutely. You got to be looking at the commodities, getting broad exposure. And then also, we've had a great run thus far, and investors have got to be on the lookout for a possible correction. Corrections happen every 327 days on average. The last correction was 255 days ago, back in May. You have low volatility. You've got a little bit of irrational exuberance, which is maybe becoming some irrational complacency.
Whoops, irrational exuberance, Paul. That could have been aimed at you, buddy, but I want to ask you, with your Panglossian view, what are your favorite investments?
Well, you got to be looking at the opportunities that are global. What we're seeing in Egypt is, an emerging consumer class. 97% of the world's population is outside the United States, 3/4 of the world's economic production. And what we're seeing, in Egypt is much akin to what we saw maybe in Tiananmen Square back a few years ago. And we've seen what has happened in China since that time with respect to the emergence of their consumer class.
All right, thank you so much, gentlemen. We appreciate it, Eric, Paul, and Michael. And when we come back, the return of emerging market risk.
Inflation, surging commodity prices in Egypt taking investors by surprise. So should you rethink investing in emerging economies?
All right, plus we're going to get the latest NYMEX oil action right now and discuss what impact the crisis in the Middle East will have on crude prices all ahead. We'll be back in just 2 minutes.